Why, howdy ho, good neighbor. We're here for another answer time. Um, this question made it to me by not the form. Shame on you, person who asked the question. You know who you are. But it was a very good question. The question was, what's the difference between England, the United Kingdom, and Great Britain? All right, we're going to cover this. It's going to go back a little farther than you wanted, and it's going to give you a bit of history, but hopefully, I think the context will make it more clear what's going on here. All right, we're going to try this again. Now I can draw some lines on this. We're using Google Maps for all of this. Thank you, Google, for letting people use your maps for all these things. Okay, so we're going to start off with the highest level delineation here, which is also a geographic delineation as opposed to a political one. The British Isles. That is not just, so that includes Ireland, England, Scotland, and these islands all the way the heckins up there, and some stuff up in the channel. All right. That roughly, because my drawing here isn't super great, but that gives you the rough idea here. We'll do that. That is the British Isles, basically. There might Jersey. I don't think Jersey's part of the British Isles technically. It might be though. Anyway, you get the idea. So that is purely a geographic thing. Okay. So now can we hide this? Cool. Okay. Now, we have to get into a little bit of history. So, we don't know a lot about what was going on here before the Romans got up to what is modern England. And they came up around here, and I mean, London was a British town, and York was a British town, and they even built a wall up all the way up in here. But the people who lived in this whole area were called the Britons. Briton. So the Britons were a Celtic people, and they integrated pretty well with the Latin Romans who came up north with them, and eventually Rome fell. Now, the Britons, or Brittonic Romans, or Roman Britons, or Latin Britons, however you want to say it, fractured off into little kingdoms up here. And that's where you think like King Arthur would have been one of them. King Arthur's real. That's a whole nother question. Okay. But they were Britons. And then, like, starting around 400 AD, you start getting invasions of Germanic peoples from this area. You start getting invasions of Germanic peoples. And the two biggest Germanic peoples in here that were invading were the Angles and the Saxons, where we get Anglo-Saxon. Now, they invade and they push the Britons. They push them into an area here. And a little bit down in here, but mostly here. Now, this area is called Wales, and the people who live there are the Welsh. The Welsh are the Britons. The name changed over the centuries. So the original people from here, and they had Wales too, got pushed over into Wales. Okay. So now you had England was a bunch of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And they fought each other, and some Vikings invaded, and all of that kind of stuff goes on. But eventually a guy by the name of Alfred the Great. Now if I do this, it should, it's not going to give me a nice box. Anyway, so then England is roughly let's hide this layer. Add a new layer. So England became, Wales got, well, we're going to take this story one piece at a time. So then this was England. This shape I am making right now. Okay. Now these were the Saxon kingdoms, and then the Norse folk that were also over here all got tied up together into this conglomerate called England. Now we still have Wales over here. It was after the invasion of William the Conqueror. You can go and see my video explaining the British royalty if you want to know more about some of these folks. But it was after William the Conqueror took over England that they invaded Wales. Now, Wales is both independent, but also quite technically part of the English crown. Not the British crown, the English crown. So England controlled all of this. Now, let's make a new layer. They like to fight with the Scottish as part of, they wanted to expand their territory and whatnot. So Scotland, Scotland, roughly that. And they fought back and forth. Sometimes they got control of the Scottish, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were down in France fighting for land in France. It was a whole thing. Eventually, you end up with the King of Scotland becoming the King of England, right? That's after Queen Elizabeth died. Her closest relative, she didn't have any heirs. Her closest relative was King James VI of Scotland. And then they became King of England, too. Now, he became James I of England. Note, he was named James VI and First because he kept those two crowns separate. He had both of them. They both went to his son. He ruled both territories equally, but he kept the crowns separate. That's like being the President of America and the President of Canada, but not letting them, not conflating those at all. Kind of. So, that goes on for a while. And then there's the English Civil War, and then there's the Glorious Revolution. And you end up then in the 1700s, early 1700s, with a lot of agitation up in Scotland. They kind of feel like they're second-class citizens. They feel like, because they kind of were being treated as second-class citizens. And they felt all of these things. Just being, that they didn't have full political rights, that, they weren't really, that the English citizens were treated better, and the powers that be, or the powers that were, decided, here's how we're going to equalize this. We're going to take these two separate kingdoms, Scotland and England, and we are going to make them one entity. Now, by this time, you have to note, most, if not all of Ireland was also under English control. English, notice, because they were still the English royalty. Scottish, yes. English was the most important. But so in 1707, I want to say, they decided to merge the crowns of Scotland and the crown of England into one new crown, Great Britain. Great Britain, the crown of Great Britain, covered both Scotland and England, although the British royalty had lands far beyond. That's the important thing to remember. When you're talking about crowns, you could have many crowns. Crowns were tied to specific areas, specific territory. So that's where it's a little confusing. But, so now the Great Britain meant these two pieces of land. Well, one piece of land, but those two political units together as one were Great Britain. Now, as you probably, or maybe you don't know, but as you could probably imagine, things weren't going great in Ireland. The Irish have always been fighting the English whenever the English were ruling in Ireland, and it just back and forth and back and forth. There's a Protestant Catholic thing, there's the invader thing, there's the Celt versus not Celt thing, there's the landed aristocracy versus the poor local folk. Lots of levels for violence and thing. Well, in the early 1800s, first 15 years of the 1800s, they tried to pull the same trick that they did with Scotland, because with Scotland there were a couple hardcore minor revolts of people who wanted to get the Stuart kings back. But then after that, Scotland, England, as part of Great Britain, it was peaceful. It worked out. And, it got the Scots more representation, more control over themselves, kind of, sort of. It got the Scots part of, though, the political community. And they're like, okay, great. That worked so well 100 years ago. And because by the time in the early 1800s, Scotland was like part of the backbone of what made Great Britain so great. And it was very vital to it. So they were like, let's try it again with Ireland. It could have worked 50 years earlier. But by that point, so much had happened with Ireland. That's like hours of video there. So much had happened with Ireland that it didn't stick. But that means, and we are going to hide these layers. When they did this, they formed the United Kingdom, which is, and this is going to seem a little silly. Oops. Well, we'll have to adjust this, because it doesn't actually include this island that I'm going around. That's the Isle of Man. It's part of the United Kingdom, the political entity, but not part of the crown. If that makes any sense to you. Okay. Save. So this is the United Kingdom. It's the crowns of Scotland, England, and Ireland. The Isle of Man is technically, I think, a vassal king or vassal kingdom. It gets very strange. They're ruled by the United Kingdom, but they are not a part of the crown, which mattered still in the 1800s. Nowadays, when we say the United Kingdom, we mean the political unit, the country, which the Isle of Man is part of. They are not part of the crown of the United Kingdom. Exciting, I know. Anyway, this didn't work. This is how it was for about 100 years. This is what the United Kingdom was, the crowns of Ireland, Scotland, and England. But in the 1920s, after World War I, that's not what I want. The Irish managed to successfully have their Irish Revolution. And they held a vote. Each county held a vote. And they got to decide whether they wanted to be part of England. If they wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom. I have to be very careful with my words here if I want to explain things right. Or if they wanted to be part of a free new Ireland. And North Ireland, which was mostly Protestant and had a lot more cultural ties to England and Scotland, voted to stay part of the United Kingdom. The rest of Ireland voted to not. So now North Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Ireland is not. Ireland used to be. The Isle of Man is not. But if we're talking then about that's only if we're talking about the crown. If we're talking about United Kingdom, the political entity, the country, if you will, the state, well, then the Isle of Man gets included, along with a bunch of other stuff around the world. And, it's like Gibraltar down here, and St. Helena right down here. Anyway, so that is the difference between those terms. Is it confusing? Yes, it is. But what you need to remember, how to remember this, is the British Islands are all of the islands that are there. England is where the Angles settled. England is where the Angles settled. Great Britain is whenever they united with Scotland, and the United Kingdom is that combined with what's left of Ireland, or what's left in the United Kingdom of Ireland. Hopefully that kind of clears things up for you at some level. Please ask more questions if you don't, if it doesn't, if you have more questions. Once again, the question form is in the description of this video. That helps me keep track of things because I think about a lot of stuff and I forget lots of stuff all the time. So, there it is. Hope that helped, and I'll see you next time. All right, bye-bye.